So welcome everyone to today's webinar with Professor Farrokhnia. My name is Matthew Monagle. I am the web manager here at Columbia Business School, and I will be walking you through today's event. Just a few notes before we get started. First of all, we're going to be using the Q&A box throughout the presentation to curate questions. The breakdown tends to be about 20 minutes of lecture and then 10 minutes of questions at the end. So as questions come to mind, please feel free to submit them through the Q&A box, and we'll go ahead and circle around back to them at the very end. Also, if you are using social media, we'll be following along using the hashtag CBSExecEd. So follow us on Twitter. You can join in the conversation there as well. And I know this is always the biggest question. We will have a full recording of this webinar available. Typically, we get those out about 3 to 5 business days after the webinar is concluded. So if you're in this room, that means you're on the webinar mailing list, and we'll make sure you get a recording of that. So without any further ado, I'm going to introduce today's guest. Professor Farrokhnia teaches both here at Columbia Business School. He teaches at the School of Engineering. And he is also the faculty director of our upcoming executive education program, From Idea to Prototype in 5 days. So Professor Farrokhnia, welcome.
Thank you, Matthew, and good day to everyone whenever you are in the world. I really appreciate your time and participation in this webinar. The topic that I'll be discussing today, it's the notion of how to almost de-risk and accelerate product development cycle, whether for a startup or a big enterprise, and the fact that I live to tell you about it. So the agenda for the day, it's that I'll be giving you a bit of an intro to the work that I do at Columbia and beyond, divided the conversation into 4 parts where good ideas typically come from. A few words on idea validation through lean user research. Then I specifically talk about the Sprint program that's coming up in December on Sprint, a methodology developed at Google Ventures. And I had the pleasure of collaborating with them and the writing of the book that was launched back in March. I talk about that in a second. And I'll give you some broad overviews of the course that we have set up for you. So hopefully these topics will be of interest to you in general. So as in terms of my background, as Matthew mentioned, I am a faculty member at Columbia Schools of Business and Engineering, and I also teach at the School of Journalism, and I'm also on the board of a Knight Badger program, which I'll discuss that in a second. The School of Business, I teach programs of my own design and development, mainly centered around applied creativity, innovation, and entrepreneurship in financial services with a focus on private equity, venture capital, and financial technology. At the School of Engineering, I teach another program, first of its kind, focused on design, lean product launch, and agile project management. Both programs are project-based only, in a sense that we not only cover the theory, but we actually work on real projects and real transactions with defined deliverables and timelines. And part of the methodology that I'll be discussing today, it's my version of a customization and adaptation of the process, best practices rather, coming out of the likes of Google and IDEO and Pentagram and a number of other companies, whether tech or those in innovation, consultancy business, and so on. I'm also exec director at the Dean's Office, especially launching a program, interdisciplinary program that I'll allude to in a second. I'm the lucky recipient of a Dean's Award for Teaching Excellence. I'm quite proud of that. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm also on the board of and a senior lecturer at the School of Journalism at Columbia. I love to break silos and connect the dots between these apparently disparate points. And very lastly, I'm also a founder and the principal investigator of a development lab, where we bring some of the ideas and research and theory that we work on into practice. And one of the main areas we focus on is indeed deploying Sprint methodology and design thinking and design studio processes to quickly validate ideas, build prototypes or MVPs around them, validate further, and spin them off. As fast and as efficiently as we can. So in essence, if you were to define me, I'd love to be the person who sits at the intersection of things. That's where the most innovative and interesting things happen to begin with. In my case, specifically academia and practice. And under each realm, a certain number of other sub-realms. These tend to be the areas I feel passionate about, and obviously based on my professional experience and background, I feel I can add the most value and be the interpreter of these worlds and bring them together. Now, as I alluded to before, part of the conversation today, it's based on the book Sprint that we launched at Columbia this past March. And the topic of this, which it's a process that Google Ventures, initially deploys exclusively in-house. And I was very fortunate to collaborate with them, not just on the process as it applies to startups, but specializing in taking this process and customize and deconstruct it and adapt it for two settings. One being academia, i.e., how do you take a 5 full day process, deconstruct it, and teach it over a semester or during an exec ed class. But also, I specialize in taking this process and make it applicable within enterprise settings, big companies in which there are certain constraints and limitations that make the process itself a bit more challenging. Everything from scheduling problems to budget issues to obviously a lot more complex hierarchies and organizational structures and so on. So without further ado, I'll get to the first part of this conversation, and the kind of pet peeve of mine that most programs focused on entrepreneurial and or inventive thinking are predicated upon someone having a good idea to begin with. That's certainly valid, and Sprint applies to that. But what I typically tend to do, both from an empirical research as well as conversations with interesting and most innovative companies in the US and abroad, it's going to understand whether there is a way you could come up with a methodology that gets you closer to that virtuous cycle of being able to develop new ideas in-house, test them, iterate, and keep developing them. And there's a whole program, and there's this whole series of lectures that I do at Columbia, as well as part of my corporate interactions and consulting world, if you will, in which we go through the semantics of how you go from a notion to a concept to an idea, and you keep developing this further and further. And I remember one day I was very curious about the origin of the word idea, and kind of looked it up on a dictionary, and it seems that it comes from the origin. It goes back to Greek. And the base of the word actually means to see and observe, which I found to be quite fascinating, because one of the most important traits that we try to infuse in our student bodies and in my programs are this notion of active observation, and being able to take into account all the things that you see around you, and all the things you like to see or you wish to see, and how you can take that process, develop the right mindset to be able to, come up with good ideas. And there are a number of processes here that you could typically put into two buckets. One bucket, it's the kind of a brainstorming model, the one that has been the most popular lately. And that is, you can put a team together and they can start and shout ideas, and you can brainstorm that way. And there's a lot of fun. What doesn't lead to the best outcomes? Research and practice both indicate that the model, the predicated on the notion of you as a team leader setting certain parameters around an idea, and then letting the idea simmer, and each member of the team go on their own and think about the idea of their own, and come back at a later point and then compare ideas. That time and again has shown to be a lot more powerful process, with much better ideas coming out of such process. And obviously observation and seeing is a big component of that. But more importantly, all of that leads to this topic that I spend a good amount of time discussing, and again giving resources to students to dwell on, and that's the notion of bricolage or bricolage. You might have heard of the term, or in case you haven't heard, if you drop the first 3 letters, you're left with collage, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. And in essence, it's what we all do in our lives, and that is trying to construct something. using a set of limited and yet available items that you create a variety of combinations and permutations with to build something bigger. In essence, we are in the business of connecting the dots, and the more disparate these dots, the better. But obviously, in order to connect the dots, you have lots of dots. You need to have lots of dots to begin with. So I have jokingly tell my team that I'm in the business of collecting dots to connect them later. And obviously, observation it's a big component of that. And all of that leading to this notion of imagination, which I feel it's probably one of the most underrated, especially in business circles, when it comes to its power to generate creative, inventive, resourceful ideas. And the quote from George Bernard Shaw, which I'm quite fond of, and some people see things the way they are and ask why, and some others dream of things that never were and ask why not. So I've trained my team, and I strive to train my students to become very good at asking the why not questions, and more importantly, be empowered to bring that notion to reality. So not just the big thinking and the big theory, but also making it real. And speaking of which, if I were to summarize everything that I do professionally and academically into one word, my preferred word would be Imagineering. And chances are most, if not all of you, have heard the term. It's typically associated with the Fortune 500 company in the US. And the response I typically get is Disney. And indeed, Disney has been one of the most prolific users of the term. But believe it or not, this was actually coined by none other than Alcoa in the 1940s. And I have an ad from Time magazine in 1942 to prove it. And I love the way they defined it. And they define it as Imagineering is letting your imagination soar and then engineering down to earth. That's exactly what I love to do in all my programs, in my dev lab, and at this upcoming exec ed class. And that is still teach everyone to think, big thoughts, the blue sky kind of thinking, but still be able to marry it to reality and build it up using, again, the limited resources that all of us have access to, rather, and available to us. So, and that's the one of the main topics covered in Sprint, which is one component of this big thinking. And throughout my career, as I'm doing more research into some of the most successful companies and products, I submit that the most successful ones have these four components embedded in their DNA right from the get-go. That is based on lean and agile engineering practices, obviously taking care of all elements around business, strategy, marketing, finance, what have you, and all-encompassing aspect of design and storytelling. And storytelling is a piece that gets the most puzzle looks. But in essence, remember this: if you can't tell, you can't sell. And no matter what you sell, whether you're trying to raise money for your venture, or trying to gather resources for it, or you're trying to lobby for it, and so on, it all boils down to the notion of selling. And coincidentally, I'm building a program at Columbia that sits at the intersection of these four disciplines. Those of you who came to the book launch at Columbia last March have saw a sneak peek of it, and we'll be releasing more information of this as we kind of go through the academic and administrative motions. So the second part I wanted to quickly touch upon would be kind of lean user research. And part of this thinking is based on the reality that, up until, I would say, 10, 15 years ago, a typical startup would be founded by a quote-unquote MBA type person. That would, you have a team of them getting together, coming up with an idea, do all the research that needs to be done, and writing a business plan, going to sources of investments, venture capital, let's say, raise money, then hire engineers, build it, test it in the marketplace, and see where it goes. Now the world has kind of turned upside down, in a sense that with all the new tools and resources that are available to us, and the very fact that the cost of doing business has dropped dramatically, and the cost of building things have dropped dramatically as well. Now you have typically engineers who dream up an idea and they can build it literally over a weekend, test it, iterate, validate, raise money, and then in turn they are the ones they're hiring the MBA types and so on. I don't feel that's necessarily is the way to go. I feel like most, at least when it comes to my current MBA students, they're kind of afraid of technology, and my job, I try to demystify it, but also give them the right tool sets and the right mindset that you don't need necessarily to know how to program to be able to validate an idea. And lean user research is one of those phenomenal tools and methodologies available to us that allow you to validate an idea and even build a prototype without having to write a single line of code. So, in essence, lean user research and lean user studies focus on providing insight into product users, pinpointing problem needs, and certain times wants, understanding the perspective, and figuring out a roadmap to affect these product users at the right time, i.e., building things that we know eventually someone would not only need but would pay for. So, and put very simply, it encompasses a few steps. As I mentioned before, observing users it's critical, as opposed to asking them what they want. Observing them first and foremost. And in my program, I get into a lot of detail around this, and this would lead to identifying problems and pain points, which eventually leads to you uncovering needs, and you would validate those assumptions coming through this exercise by now just interviewing users and repeating the process. And all of this would lead to what we call evidence-based product design, development, and deployment, ensuring that you're not building something in vacuum, and you're building something that truly addresses a need. I always say, and if you were to take away one sentence from this entire webinar exercise, is that technology doesn't sell, solutions sell. So, and if deployed correctly, lean user research will help you figure out what is it that people need, what are the problems, can you build a solution to address it, given the limited resources that you have available at any point in time. Can people use it, and will they continue using it down the line? And ideally, will they or someone else pay for the product? Believe it or not, there are problems in the world that don't need solving, or if you solve it, no one would pay for it. So we try to stay away from those challenges, at least initially. And another notion around lean user research, I think, would be interesting for you to know about, is this concept of hypothesis formation. How to take user research and put it in simple terms that you can act upon. And this simple formula does wonders in terms of you putting your ideas and the outcome of user research into something that you see on your screens. And the second part of it also gives you the proper way to be able to get proper market feedback and be able to validate, iterate, and repeat the process throughout. So, having said this, I wanted to spend a minute or two on a few slides talking about the 5 stages of a sprint, the way we teach it and the way we deploy it. If it done properly, you would do it throughout, a full working week, 5 days, typically, 9 to 6 or 10 to 6. But there are ways that you have developed, you can deconstruct it and do it over a longer time frame, again, depending on scheduling limitations or resource limitations that you may be having. So we typically spend day one in understanding the problem. Sometimes teams come in with an existing idea or a prototype or a product they need to develop. Sometimes the mandate is a bit broader than that. We want to make sure we're on the right track and we're developing something that the company hasn't thought about before. It would be more of an inventive way to build and engage customers. So we do that day 2. We bring all the learnings from day 1, which includes on-the-field research and observations and interviews, and we built a lot of sketches around our ideas. And we go through a number of voting rounds in day 3 to narrow down the field and decide upon that one final prototype or a few that we feel are rising through the top. Day 4, one of the most intense days and probably one of the most fun days, is actually where we are building these prototypes, and it's quite intense, but it's a lot of fun as well. And day 5 is where we do live testing of the prototypes, bringing in outside test subjects, And here is where you do more of an art and a science combined as you're doing user research live. And it's obviously the outcome of this is superbly important. And in terms of, I get questions a lot around the, the proper audience and where you can deploy sprints. I always say that if you think about the life cycle of a company, on one end you just have an idea on the back of a napkin. On the other end of the spectrum, you have a very mature company, thousands of employees, tens of thousands, and global offices, and so on. The early stage part would be, again, you're developing the idea further, perhaps raising some money, and then the company starts maturing a bit more and more and more. And then you get to a point that you might actually, do an exit or engage in an M&A or access capital markets. Here, the sprint adapted properly could be applicable to each of these settings. And the beauty of the process it is customization and the ability for you to understand the impact of it and what this brings to the table, and be empowered to fit it into your needs, regardless of where you are on this cycle. And lastly, just in case any of you would be interested in topics in early December, mid-December, we are offering the inaugural program on a sprint, i.e. how to go from idea to prototype in 5 days. It's a highly interactive, team-based effort with a lot of cool features I'm bringing into fruition. The program will be offered in the week of December 12th to 16th in New York City. And as I mentioned, the relevant audience would be both, entrepreneurs to be, as well as executives in the various corporations, whether small, mid-size, or large. It's all certainly doable. So you can find more information at Columbia Exec Ed or following this link. And if you have any direct questions, feel free to contact Anthony, whose name is also listed on our on Exec Ed website. So with that, I'll pass it back to Matthew. I'll be happy to entertain any questions you may have.
Professor, thank you so much. We actually have a lot of good questions coming in, so we're going to jump right into them. The first one that we have is from Felipe, and they ask about multidisciplinary teams. If you're working with a team that has a bunch of different functions represented, how do you prepare them before you start in on the actual sprint process?
Excellent question. Coincidentally, just last week, we covered this very topic in my engineering class, and that's where I had collaborated with Google, various groups at Google specifically, because Google has been one of the best companies when it comes to not just tracking data as someone is being employed, but tracking them post-employment and ensuring that they understand if there are any patterns that leads to creation of really good, solid teams. And they have undertaken a 3+ year process through this, and literally how to create the perfect team. And the notion that Felipe, you alluded to, it's very important. I'm very keen on diversity and the fact that diversity brings the best of innovation. If I'm surrounded by like-minded people, most likely we're going to come up with the same ideas, none of which are interesting at all. But it just requires a certain new way of thinking, which coincidentally can be taught to a large extent. I mean, there aren't that many companies whose culture is so toxic that none of these items that I'm talking about would be applicable to. But the notion that when you bring these four disciplines together, and this is a lot of my work, especially at Columbia, around this topic, how do you demystify and crack the code and have each teams communicate properly and learn the language of the other? I mean, don't get me wrong, I don't expect my MBA students to become full stack programmers and hackers overnight, but I'm teaching them the language of technology and teaching them as opposed to a bottoms up approach, a top down approach. I teach them about cloud, security, infrastructure, stack. So when they interact with my engineers, they're speaking the same language, and do the same for my designers, and they ensure that my engineers and the MBAs and the storytellers understand grid, color theory, and so on and so forth. So it's this notion of setting a common language amongst them, train them in way that they need to communicate with each other, so they're talking about the same things and understand each other's limitations and possibilities, and keep monitoring and iterating that group. So I'd be happy to discuss that offline. If you're ever interested, please feel free to send me an email. It's an important, very important topic that doesn't get discussed much, but I would love to follow up if anyone else has any questions on that.
So we have a few more questions that are kind of in a similar vein, which is people talking about their own industries. They work in these large or not particular agile industries such as pharma, such as government work. How can they take the sprint methodology and apply that to industries that might not be as receptive to prototyping, to trying new things?
Well, industry itself, it's important, i.e. you cannot prototype a medical drug in 5 days. That's the reason that process takes years, if not decades. And you probably don't want to prototype a passenger jet in 5 days either. That's, again, a reason building a passenger takes a decade and tens of billions of dollars. But those are just a few examples of areas in which the methodology taken as a whole would not be applicable to the end product, but for each of the components that go into it, with the exception of biopharma or medical discovery and so on, it's very much possible. So part of it, could be mandated by the top, execs at the firm. But I've seen many instances, and based on, again, my experience and my team's experience working with a variety of corporations, is that typically invariably you end up having a team of entrepreneurs or intrapreneurs within any big entity, and they have a way of finding each other, which is quite remarkable and beautiful in a way. And they want to change their organization from within, but obviously they don't have a whole lot of resources. They're willing to spend the nights and weekends on a project of interest. And typically, once we take them through the process, we teach them the methodology, and then we empower them to run on their own. Being able to produce something they can take to their superiors and show them a tangible product, as opposed to talk about this in abstract or just show them a PowerPoint deck, if you will. When they go back to the superiors an actual prototype and some data behind it in terms of user engagement, that tends to do wonders and tends to open up doors. So it's certainly doable. We have seen it time and again. It's a matter of finding, starting with the team that's creative and entrepreneurial enough and wants to, take certain chances, and then they're willing to work a little hard for a while, and hopefully your organization's culture and general setup would be conducive to such efforts.
So we have another question here, which I really like, which is saying that as they're going through the stages, one of the things that people have encountered is difficulty in cutting out bad ideas during the ideation phase. So do you have any insight into processes you can have in place that'll help people get rid of some of the ideas that aren't going to be the final solutions?
Absolutely. Another good question. Every year in my dev lab, we go through hundreds of ideas, but no more than 6 to 8 actually are the ones that we end up spinning off. And a big percentage of those don't even make it to the MVP round, i.e., we are extremely disciplined and we hold ourselves to a set of very high standards in ensuring that we don't fall in love with any idea in particular. We are disciplined about the areas in which we focus on, i.e., we don't develop ideas around anything. If anyone comes up to me and tells me, "Professor, I have a great idea for a restaurant," unfortunately, I won't be able to help much because that's not my core area of expertise. But within the areas that I mentioned, financial technology, ad tech, media tech, enterprise softwares and solutions, health tech, especially data, machine learning, deep learning, artificial intelligence, neural networks, those are some of the areas that we have developed a lot of core expertise, but also lean and agile methodologies that we can deploy those and scale them really quickly. So that definitely helps. And ensuring that you're on the right track and you're not spinning wheels and spending costly resources on bad ideas is critical. And again, a sprint and lean user research that I talked about can definitely help in reducing some of the friction up front in identifying good versus bad ideas.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. We've gotten a tremendous amount of questions today, so I want to thank you all for your engagement. And we'll be sure to pass these along to the professor too, and feel free to reach out to him and contact him as well. But kind of the last one is one that we actually got first, and I wanted to circle back to it. When you're building out these design sprints, somebody was asking for clarification in what is engineering and what is design, and sort of those two processes and where you might draw the line on those.
So the way we tackle this is that God bless my engineering students. They can truly dream up an idea on a Friday, and on Monday morning they come to my office and they have a prototype. And I typically ask them, have you done user research on this? They go, yeah. I'm like, who did you talk to? The answer is, well, I talked to my mom, dad, and to my roommates. They all love the idea, and they would say they would pay for it. Well, to be honest, that's not proper user research. But invariably, they hear all those encouraging comments from friends and family, and that leads them to develop something that might be actually a good idea, but the execution of it's poor. And because they are empowered to build it, they don't want to spend time thinking about the actual sort of a holistic approach to user experience, user interface. They build something and typically it looks ugly. And that, once they go out and show it to, potential real users, the answer is typically, oh, we hate this. So design is incredibly important because it encourages you to kind of slow down your thinking process a bit. Especially when it comes to engineers, sometimes I do not let my engineering team write a single line of code because I want them to go through the proper process. And design allows you to take into account a variety of factors that engineering per se, especially back-end processes, don't totally overlook, and they don't have to take that into account. So, but this is predicated once more on the notion of having designers who are, to a large extent well versed in technology, and they can speak the right language to the engineers. And I cannot tell you how countless times when we had these teams embedded right from a get-go of the product development cycle, as opposed to treat them in silos and bring them together toward the tail end, how much savings we have realized. I had some teams that sit and discuss, well, the engineering team goes, well, we have to build the back end this way and the front end that other way. And then my designers go, well, if you do it that way, I'll be forced to buy this license for this expensive tool down the line. So why not do it this other way, which I can leverage an open source tool? And all of a sudden we saved 150 grand within 2 minutes. So being able to have those constituents right from a get-go and have good team members obviously is important, but this is something that can be learned. But design and engineering, I feel like they should be embedded right from a get-go, should be together alongside obviously business and storytelling, as opposed to be treated as separate disciplines, that you have separate teams work on it disparately.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for your wonderful questions. I'm afraid that's all the time we have for today. The program, of course, is from idea to prototype in 5 days. And then first iteration of this will run on December 12th to December 16th here at Columbia Business School. As a reminder, you will be getting an email with a copy of this webinar recording in about 3 to 5 business days, so keep a lookout for that. And we are going to redirect you at the end of this webinar to our Qualtrics survey for today's webinar. Please take a few minutes, leave some feedback, leave some questions or concerns you might not have been able to get in here at the very end, and we'll make sure we look at them and get back to you. So, Professor Farrokhnia, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.